So what kind of ethical issues have these large corporations faced to date? Google has had several. The European Union imposed a $2.7 billion fine for Google engines favoring their shopping service over others. They complained that the Google Play Store needs Chrome in order to install it, and it should be able to be retrieved from any browser, not just their own. An important detail from a Microsoft lawsuit case there. That Google pays phone makers to install only their search engine. So they have exclusive access there, and that it does not allow them to alter the Android OS. So in many situations in computer science, you're able to take an existing product and add features to it to make your product look better. And Google requires the Android to stay untouched. There was a Canadian court ruling that said Google search engines must remove some companies from their search results, especially if it's secure or secret, or the company prefers it that way. And they must do it not only in Canada, but across the globe, because those are Canadian companies that they're reporting on. They also have been taken to task for YouTube content that terrorists are sharing, and they are trying very hard to figure out how to keep terrorist content off of YouTube. They have been taken to task for having private medical results show up in searches, and they have been ordered to remove those private medical records. And they were also using the Gmail that you wrote that you thought might be your own to scan your preferences to decide what personalized ads they would give you. And that has also been discussed as not ethical. So you can see that Google has enough issues here already. The wrong things showing up in searches, favoring its service over others, which is what monopolies do. Again, a monopoly feature of keeping their system only, of requiring Chrome, of installing only their search engine. These things that the EU fined them for are definitely monopoly type activities that antitrust laws are designed to protect against. But they have other issues of not including things in a search, of how to distinguish when their users have bad intent, searching the wrong things and having it appear, or really unethically using what they've given you for free in order to focus ads towards you. Google has also been accused of not doing enough to hire and promote women and minorities. And in the maelstrom of these complaints, a Google software engineer wrote an internal memo called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber in July 2017, which got press in August 2017, saying that basically Google has done too much to hire and promote women and minorities, and that they're fundamentally incapable of doing the job on average, and so they shouldn't be there. Google was faced with an ethical dilemma here. Google's corporate culture encourages people to speak up. The writer was using an internal board that they used to discuss things to make the company better. And yet the memo got leaked to the press and they were being hammered by the press. So Google did fire the software engineer, and they fired him for advancing harmful gender and racial stereotypes in the workplace. In fact, some of Google's female engineers threatened to quit if he wasn't fired. At the same time, Google is being pinged on for not hiring enough women and men. it didn't make Google look good. Why is it important if Google looks good? Because if Google looks bad, they will start looking at more of those antitrust issues. But this brings up a more important issue to me than just what I shall use the word gentleman wrote. Should there be limits to open discussion in the workplace? Google's cultural policy is you can really discuss almost anything, but he did so with bad data and stereotypes that are insulting, and they were insulting both to women and minorities. So the sophomore engineer was named James Damore, and his paper was how bias from the left, which tells us there has to be diversity, clouds our thinking about what we should actually diversify and who we should and should not include. And he looked at what he called population differences in distributions. That means he looked at normal curves and said they're shifted for different populations. He argued, and I quote, differences in distribution of traits between men and women may in part explain why we don't have 50% representation of women in tech and leadership. He said this without doing additional studies. The same thing was said about female doctors decades ago. They said the reason we don't have women in the medical field is because they're not good at science, they're biologically different, and they don't want to work as hard. And yet now we have an enormous share of women in that field, although they face almost as much backlash from their colleagues as women in computer science. So what were these stereotypes? I thought I would point them out to you. Damore states without proof that women are more open towards feelings and aesthetics rather than ideas. That they have a stronger interest in people than things. That they're gregarious rather than assertive. That they have a higher agreeableness. He also says we're neurotic, that we have higher levels of anxiety and a lower stress tolerance. I think he has never been around a large group of 3-year-olds because on average, and I think this is just because of lack of exposure, men might incur a quite high stress level there. And the women who have been doing it for a lot longer time do in fact show lower stress tolerances, I think, in those regions. So this certainly depends on how used one is to the task. I'm not saying that, I shouldn't have said it that way, I sort of said men, but people who haven't been around children, in fact, have a much higher stress tolerance when they have to watch a bunch of kids. He says women are more cooperative and they want a work-life balance. And he thinks that these stereotypes characterize why women don't make it into Google. He then complained about equal opportunity practices. And this issue is non-trivial, and it's not related just to Google. Universities which have used EEO criteria for admission for a long time have been working on changing their EEO levels for the last decade. The effort has been led actually from an African American in California who felt that the policies were no longer needed. As a result, some schools in Southern California have a minuscule number of African Americans being accepted, and those students have complained online in several very entertaining videos about the difficulties of being such a small minority on a campus. He says that for the same work, women get paid just as much as men without proof, and there are many studies on income gaps. I give you some figures below. And he also says women spend more money than men, again, without any proof. And the comparisons are hard to do here, but especially since they tend to do the shopping, women do spend more money on the smaller things, but the men's toys that they buy for themselves tend to more than compensate. Boats, fishing boats. I have a fishing boat, so I shouldn't say just men, but I've seen studies where they compare them, and this is the smaller day-to-day items, where this is the larger toys. So what Google was faced with was, if they fired more, did they quash freedom of speech? That would definitely be unethical. If they didn't fire more, then they appeared to be backing stereotypes that were known to be not correct in given studies. Worse, he didn't quote any studies for his, he quoted a few, but he wrote facts without checking them, and he wrote things as if they were true, and they were not. So here's an example. The 2017 study on the wage gap within occupations. Because remember, he said for the same work, women get paid just as much as men. So there are studies within occupations, and they studied 114 occupations, and in 107 of them, the men made more than the women. The largest gaps were surgeons, nurses, lawyers, CEOs, administrators, accountants, financial managers, stock traders, loan officers, retail selling, housekeeping, janitors, insurance agents. The list goes on and on. There was a smaller gap for buyers, writers, pharmacists, counselors, social workers, security guards, and computing. But there was still a significant gap, statistically significant. 6 occupations had no gap. They were the same for women and men. And there was one in their study, but there are a few fields that have been reported. So I'm going to give you more than just the one from their study, where women earn more. That's in farming, medical assistants, order clerks, bartender assistants, healthcare support, electrical engineers, which I found very interesting, sewing machine operators, construction. So his big problem was he didn't do enough to check all of his facts. Apple has also been the center of many unethical complaints. It has been proven in court that Apple stole tech designs, or proven within enough reasonable doubt to make them pay for it. They have also been accused of running Chinese sweatshop labor in China for their iPod factory workers. Their factory workers lived in the factory. They worked 60 hours or more work weeks. They were required to put in overtime. They made about $100 a month. They had to live in the factory. They had to pay rent, and they had to buy food from the company. Now, it's true that Apple is not directly employing these people. Apple is employing a company who is employing these people. But this is an awfully lot like the sharecroppers in the South, who were really tied to the land because they owed too much money to make another choice and get away. Apple has also engaged in anti-competitive behavior. They have put proprietary parts on their devices so that if you have to take it apart, you can't put it back together with anything but their parts. They have soldered RAM chips onto motherboards so that you can't switch out your RAM chips. They have glued on batteries so that you can't switch out the batteries. And they use proprietary rather than standardized software components sometimes in hardware, like I/O controllers. They tend to use a proprietary one instead of SATA.